Greeting those of you just joining us. You more than likely are coming from another session, and I appreciate you attending. We'll get started here in just a minute.
Some faces and names that I recognize. Good to see you guys.
Welcome, everybody.
Thank you all for attending, and I appreciate you starting the faculty track. This is the first of 3 sessions we're providing for the adjunct role. My name's Curtis Blocker. I'm with Faculty Training and Development, and I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Waldschmidt and Dr. Chess. They are going to be sharing the dissertation or research designs in terms of dissertation for non-dissertation faculty. So I'm excited about what they're going to provide, and I'm going to turn it over to them. You'll see the link in the chat here where you can register for your certificate. But thank you for your work in this, and excited to see what you have.
All right.
Thank you.
So I'm going to go ahead and go on to our next page. We're going to be presenting our core research designs. It's going to be a very high level look. And so we have work to save some time at the end. So if you have questions, please pop them in the chat, and Curtis will let us know at the end of the presentation. So we want to define and differentiate qual versus quant methodologies, and then just provide an overview of our core designs. So Dr. Chess, I will hand it over to you for part of our slide here.
Alrighty, so will you go to the next slide?
Did it not move to our methodology slide?
Now it has.
Joys of slow technology.
A little delay. Well, welcome everybody. As Jennifer said, we are doing a high-level approach to what it means to think about core designs in dissertation research. So the first cut that we see around thinking about conducting dissertation research is a difference between qualitative and quantitative methodologies. So I'm just going to do a quick description here about a qualitative methodology. Qualitative is really about doing a deep dive and understanding depth, meaning, context for any particular population of people with whom one is doing the study. So a shared social context is really important in qualitative work in order to discover meaning. And you might think about a shared social context as anywhere from a community or an organization or or something like a shared set of experiences, such as experiencing COVID. Generally speaking, qualitative methodology has a smaller sample size than a quantitative methodology. Sometimes it can be as small as 10 people, and sometimes it can go up to 30 to 50 people, but in being conducted in very sort of personal, up close and in-depth ways. The sources of data, which you can also think of as what do you collect when you go out and collect data, what are the kinds of ways that you do that, tend to focus again on understanding and discovering insight, meaning, and experience for the participants. So interviews are something that are frequently used, for example, and observations can be used, and focus groups can be used, but as things that tend to produce a lot of volume of data in order for a researcher to really analyze what's going on. And then ultimately, these data get synthesized and analyzed across participants or across groups in ways that show patterns of meaning. And I'm going to hand it to Dr. Waldschmidt to talk about quantitative methodology.
Thank you, Dr. Chess. So we tried to come up with some quantitative parallels to go with our qualitative ones that we have on the left side. So with quantitative, we're really measuring variables to conduct hypothesis testing. We'll see later that we might be just describing things, but we're really looking at measuring variables and doing something with those, majority of which is going to be testing hypotheses. As Dr. Chess mentioned, on the qual side, we have smaller sample sizes, but on the quant, we tend to have much larger ones. And so, for example, for Pearson correlation analysis, we're typically looking at a minimum of 84 participants at the end of the day. Instead of sources that look at in-depth information, we're really looking at sources that are valid and reliable instruments. And so these are generally instruments that have been vetted, instruments where the learners can go and look up the validity information, the reliability information, typically Cronbach's alpha, and report on that. And then we want to express our findings statistically. So do we reject the null hypothesis? Do we retain the null hypothesis? What's our p-value? What was our power? So on and so forth. So we're using a lot of those statistical components in our quantitative methodology. So we wanted to provide this broad overview of methodology before we got into the discussion on designs, because each methodology has their own list of designs that we're going to discuss on the next handful of slides. And really the design is going to help the learners with knowing how to approach their study. It can guide the instrumentation or the sources of data, how they collect their data. It can help them or guide the analysis. It can guide the results. So we will get a little bit deeper into some of this on some of our next slides. Dr. Chess, as soon as that slide pops up for you all, I've changed it on my side.
Okay. Still waiting for it. It should come in a moment. There we go. So there are 5 qualitative designs that we generally talk about at GCU, and there are 3 of them that tend to be used most frequently. The first 2 that we use most frequently are shown here on this slide. And so a qualitative case study is a study of a population that is bounded in some particular way. So we're not just looking at sort of an array of individuals, but rather individuals, people who are located in a particular situation. So that bounded situation could constitute a case. So that might be a school, or it might be a school district, or it might be an organization, or it might be a department within an organization. It might be a professional organization. It might be a community group, but something where the researcher can say this is a bounded social entity in some way. That would constitute a case. And cases are, once again, as all qualitative, a fairly in-depth investigation, and use at least 3 sources of data. And analytically, triangulation is used to achieve a holistic description and understanding of the nature of the case. So one can end up saying, we can say XYZ about this case. And triangulation is an analytic form of comparing elements across the various sources of data. A qualitative descriptive study is particularly useful if there is a phenomenon that's not very well understood. And although we say surface level descriptions here, I don't want to emphasize the surface too much, but it does mean that there needs to be a broad description to describe a little understood phenomenon. So for example, we might think about a phenomenon as how people in certain circumstances are experiencing and thinking about and describing COVID. So would those descriptions be the same for people who are elderly, or people who are teenagers, or people who live in cities, or people who live in countries, or people who live in agricultural areas, or people who might be Hispanic, or African American, or white in any of those other kinds of circumstances I've described. So all of those things that I'm talking to you about are kinds of social contexts. And we talked a moment ago about the importance of the social context when doing a qualitative study. So qual descriptive is saying, let me do at least a description so I can understand in broad forms and how people describe it, and how I, as an analyst, a research analyst, would analyze those various descriptions to come up with an overarching description about the phenomenon in order to give some initial understanding of it. And then later studies might go into greater depth with different kinds of designs to understand those particular contexts more specifically. So as it notes here, the researcher wants to investigate people's reports and then analyze the nature of those reports along a number of these dimensions. Could you go to the next slide, Dr. Waldschmidt?
I have moved to the next slide, so hopefully we'll catch up with you soon.
I'm sure. Here we go. So a narrative inquiry is a design, a qualitative design that focuses in particular on the way people still tell stories about their lives or an event or a circumstance, whatever is being defined in the study. And the idea of this is that stories, first of all, we all tell stories. When we talk about our lives, we tend to tell them in story form as a natural way of speaking. And so this is really looking at the idea that people express meaning and what's important to them in their lives through stories. So the narrative inquiry will focus in collecting data in story form. It's listening for stories, it's eliciting stories, and the analysis may describe the stories and produce a collective sort of overarching story pulled from all the particular stories. And again, this is within a particular kind of shared social context. Phenomenology is a design that has been growing a great deal, particularly in psychology, and it's the third one in addition to case study and qualitative descriptive that we see used most commonly at GCU. And phenomenology is a very particular kind of design that aims at understanding the way people experience what's called a lived experience. And what that means in this case is it's people who go through some kind of circumstance or event or episode that tries to get at how it felt to experience that episode. So for example, you might think of wanting to understand psychologically something about mothers who have lost their children. And what the inquiry would get at is the experience of how it felt in various ways about the loss of a child. And it would be very focused and very in-depth, very unique and very subjective. That's the whole point. This isn't an objective study. This is a highly subjective study, really seeking to understand the way those people in that circumstance experience the feelings of what it was like to be in that circumstance. Finally, grounded theory is the fifth design. And grounded theory is the one that takes the most time. The idea of grounded theory is that one develops a theory or a model based on data collection in a very grounded way. So through often very long, months to years long data collection efforts, the grounded theory develops from an inductive analysis of what is going on, what we call on the ground, what are people actually doing? So it analytically means that there's a data collection process, and then those data are analyzed, and then new questions come out of that data, and then another set of data collection queries take place, again, analysis, again, new questions, and then yet another round. And so as you can see, because there are multiple rounds in grounded theory, this is a fairly long process in a design, but it's a very powerful process because it's really looking to seek new knowledge in a new way. And those are the 5 qualitative designs, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Waldschmidt.
Thank you, Dr. Tress. So the quantitative designs, and hopefully the slides will catch up here, I'm going to kind of break them into 2 broad categories, experimental and non-experimental. For our experimental designs, we're really looking at assessing causal claims. So in order to do that, we have to make sure that our studies are set up in a way that allow us to assess causal claims. So we have our pre-experimental group or design, which is where we're really looking typically at one group pre-test, post-test. So a group does something, there's an intervention, then that group is measured post-intervention, and we compare pre-intervention to post-intervention. We might do a static group comparison design where we have something similar to what I talked about, but we also add a secondary group. So we look at one group post-intervention, another control group that didn't get the intervention, and we compare the post scores, for example. Or we might use a quasi-experimental design, which is even stronger than the pre-experimental. And here we might do non-equivalent control group designs or simple interrupted time series design. So you're doing, the visual here is XXXXO, XXXX, where O represents the treatment. So there's quite a few different things that we can do in here. These aren't the only ones that we have. So there are other pre-experimental or quasi-experimental designs. We don't see experimental too often here at GCU, so we kept it at those two. The next set, the next four, are our non-experimental designs. So we're really looking at relationships or group differences. First, I'm going to talk about more of our relationship-oriented ones. So we're going to look at correlational or associative, which is where we're really looking at a relationship between variables. Typically, it's between two variables. So how does X correlate to Y? Typical analyses with these, we have Pearson correlation or the non-parametric Spearman correlation. We also, though, might be looking at predicting a variable. So to what extent do X and Y predict Z? If that's the type of thing that we're looking at, then we would be in the correlational predictive design. And typical analyses there would be linear regression or multiple linear regression. Most of the time we see multiple linear regression out of the ones that I have listed on the slide. Dr. Chess, can you all see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, I'm still seeing, I'm sorry, I'm still seeing correlation.
Perfect. I'm about to switch it to the next one. And I apologize if I'm talking too quickly. I'm trying to make sure that we leave time for questions here as well. The last two designs are really looking at group differences. So we have comparative, which is aligned to what used to be our causal comparative design, but the word causal there tends to throw students off quite a bit. So we are not looking at any causation claims with these two types of designs. With comparative, we're looking at differences between two pre-existing groups. So let's say smokers and non-smokers, and we want to see if one group has an increase in cancer, for example, relative to the other group. We are using primary data in our comparative design. If a learner is looking at group differences, but they are using archival data, then that would fall under the ex post facto design. So that ex post facto simply means after the fact. So there we are looking at group differences, but we are using secondary data, archival data, something that we're not really controlling, but just going back and looking at what others have already measured and told us, reported that exist. So those are our very high level looks at the designs. We want to make sure that we leave time for questions. So if you all have questions, please throw them in the chat, and we are more than happy to go deeper into any of the designs that we discussed or methodology, whatever y'all have questions on.
I don't see any questions yet. We do have just a minute or two. One thing that may be helpful for faculty is if you could briefly just speak to the track that set up where learners are having to choose between quant and qual, and how that works in terms of the college and their doctoral journey.
Sure. Pasha, would you like me to hit on that, or would you like to hit on that?
Oh, Dr. Berman would like to talk about it, as we do have a plan for our new curriculum that is under design.
Sure. Can everyone
Dr.
hear me?
Berman?
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yep.
The way this is going to work, in the first year, every student will take 2 courses, each course being 2 months long, and they'll be introduced to the quant and the qual. In between these 2 courses, there'll be a residency also. So at the end of the first year, they will have taken 2 specific courses that introduce quant and qual, okay? And then also we're redesigning RES 811 to be an introduction also to the whole idea of research. So once they do that, at the end of the first year, they make an actual decision. I'm going to go quant, or I'm going to go qual. In the second year, there's a 4-course sequence where they'll actually go through another 4 months of introduction, again, to quant or qual. No, just at that point, they've made the decision, and then they go into a second residency, and the second residency is actually specific to whether or not they're going quant or qual. In the third year, they actually assign the dissertation chair, and at the same time, they have 2 more courses in either quant or qual. The third course is data collection, and the 4th course is actually then the analysis of it. So in general, they're getting a lot more bandwidth in quant or qual, but they make that determination at the end of the first year. Does that answer the question? Or should I go into more detail?
Yeah, this is excellent just to give that overview in terms of connecting. And the only other thought I had was just, I was actually one that asked that just because I think it's a good tie-in to kind of the logistics of how that's working in the advent of that too. So I appreciate you speaking to that. I don't see any other questions right now, except that we are going to provide these resources for all of you. And I want to say a big thank you to our presenters, Dr. Chess and Dr. Waldschmidt, and the very clear and deliberate communication had of this high level overview. I really appreciate your work. And thank you to all that attended. The next session is for the faculty track is on DQ strategies. So we'll see you there. That starts at 4. So we'll see you there soon.
Curtis, thank you and Marlene as well for all of your work on this.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you.